The morning of August 17th, 1943, 28,000 feet above the North Sea, Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson gripped the control stick of his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and watched the sun glint off the metal fuselage of the B-17 bombers ahead. Below him, England's coast was disappearing. Ahead lay the German heartland, Schweinfurt and Regensburg, targets that would soon become names written in blood. His Thunderbolt, a machine the British had mockingly called a flying milk bottle, carried him forward at 300 miles per hour. But it wasn't the weight of the aircraft that pressed down on him. It was the knowledge of what waited beyond the horizon. Every pilot in the 56th Fighter Group knew the statistics. The Luftwaffe's Focke-Wulf 190 had dominated European skies since its appearance in August 1941. Fast, agile, deadly. The German pilots who flew them were veterans of campaigns that had crushed Poland, France, and nearly broken Britain. They had refined their craft through years of combat, while American pilots like Johnson were still learning to taxi. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Johnson scanned the sky, his eyes moving in the practiced pattern drilled into him during training. Check 6 o'clock, check 12, check the bombers. The radio crackled with transmissions from other flights, but he maintained radio discipline. His hands, steady on the controls, betrayed none of the tension coiling in his gut. He had logged fewer than 10 combat missions. The weight of that inexperience sat heavy in the cockpit beside him. Then he saw them, dark specks against the high cirrus clouds, growing larger with impossible speed. Focke-Wulf 190s, perhaps a dozen, diving from altitude with the sun at their backs. The German formation split like a predator pack, some angling for the bombers, while others positioned to engage the escorts. Johnson's flight leader called the break. The carefully maintained formation dissolved into individual combat as 8 Thunderbolts turned hard into the attacking Germans. What happened in the next 30 seconds would shatter assumptions that had guided Luftwaffe tactical doctrine for 2 years. The Germans had prepared for many things. They had prepared for the P-38 Lightning with its distinctive twin booms. They had tangled with Spitfires over the Channel. But they were not prepared for what the Thunderbolt could do. And they certainly were not prepared for the sound. The sound of 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns firing simultaneously from a single aircraft was unlike anything else in aerial warfare. Each gun fired at approximately 850 rounds per minute. Multiply that by 8 guns, and a P-47 pilot, who held the trigger for just 3 seconds, unleashed 340 rounds of half-inch bullets into a target area roughly 6 feet in diameter at 300 yards. The convergence point where all 8 streams of fire met had been calibrated through exhaustive testing. American engineers had refined it to devastating precision. Johnson rolled his Thunderbolt inverted and pulled through, coming out in a steep diving attack on the nearest Focke-Wulf. The German pilot, an experienced veteran named Oberleutnant Klaus Müller, who had 16 victories over the Eastern Front, saw the bulky American fighter commit to the attack. He did what training and experience told him to do. He pulled into a sharp climbing turn, confident that the heavy P-47 could not follow. The Thunderbolt's reputation preceded it, slow to climb, ponderous in turns, a dive bomber at best. Müller's intelligence briefings had told him the American fighter was armed with 8 machine guns. Yes, but machine guns were not cannons. His own aircraft mounted 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. The cannons hit harder. The Americans would need sustained fire to damage his aircraft. He would need only a brief burst to cripple theirs. But Müller had miscalculated. He had never experienced what happened when all 8 50s opened fire at once. Johnson closed to 200 yards, compensating for the P-47's weight in his turn, and pressed the trigger on his control stick. The Thunderbolt shuddered. Not from recoil alone, though firing 8 50 caliber machine guns simultaneously generated 1,500 pounds of thrust in the opposite direction. The aircraft shuddered because of the sheer violence being unleashed from its wings. In the first half-second of fire, 42 bullets reached the Focke-Wulf. Müller heard the impacts before he understood what was happening, a sound like hail on a tin roof, but louder, faster, more relentless. Then his right wing exploded. The 50 caliber rounds, each carrying nearly twice the kinetic energy of a German 7.92mm bullet, tore through aluminum skin, support struts, fuel lines, and control cables with mechanical indifference. The wing root cannon ammunition bay detonated from a tracer strike. The explosion was not large, but it severed the wing's main spar. Müller had 3 seconds to register what was happening before the wing folded upward and his aircraft entered an uncontrollable spin. He managed to jettison his canopy and bail out, but the lesson would travel through the Luftwaffe like electricity through copper wire. The Americans had brought something new to the European sky. Not faster, not more maneuverable, but devastating in ways the Germans had not anticipated. The air battle over the North Sea that morning lasted 27 minutes. When the Thunderbolts turned for home, their ammunition largely expended, they left behind 16 destroyed German fighters confirmed by gun camera footage. The 56th Fighter Group lost 2 aircraft. One pilot was killed when his damaged P-47 crashed attempting to land at an emergency strip. The other was captured after parachuting into occupied Holland. But the numbers told only part of the story. The real revelation was playing out in Luftwaffe ready rooms across occupied France that evening. Surviving German pilots gathered over schnapps and cigarettes, their hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline, and tried to explain what they had encountered. The descriptions varied in detail but converged on a central truth. The American fighters' firepower was catastrophic. One pilot, Lieutenant Hans Werner, described being hit by what he estimated was a 3-second burst. His Focke-Wulf had absorbed perhaps 80 rounds. The empennage was shredded. The left aileron was gone completely. Control cables hung in exposed ribbons from holes in the fuselage. The armor behind his seat had stopped at least 6 rounds that would have killed him, but the impacts had cracked 2 ribs and left his back a mass of bruises. His aircraft was written off. He would not fly again for 6 weeks. The industrial reality behind the P-47's firepower had been years in development. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun was a weapon of unusual pedigree, refined through decades of American arms development. John Browning had designed the original weapon in 1918, but it was the interwar period that transformed it from a promising concept to a masterpiece of engineering. The gun weighed 84 pounds. Its rate of fire of approximately 850 rounds per minute balanced reliability with sustained operation. Most critically, its half-inch bullet carried enough kinetic energy at combat ranges to penetrate German armor protection that would stop lighter rounds completely. Republic Aviation had built the P-47 around a radical concept. Make the fighter large enough to mount 8 of these weapons with sufficient ammunition for sustained engagement. The Thunderbolt carried 3,400 rounds total. At maximum rate of fire, a pilot had approximately 30 seconds before his guns went silent. But 30 seconds of fire from 8 synchronized 50 caliber machine guns was sufficient to destroy multiple enemy aircraft if the pilot's aim was true. The Germans, in contrast, had pursued a different philosophy. The Focke-Wulf 190 carried 4 weapons in various configurations. 2 20mm MG 151 cannons mounted in the wing roots delivered devastating individual hits, but at a slower rate of fire. The 2 13mm MG 131 machine guns mounted in the engine, cowling offered higher velocity, but less mass per projectile. The total weight of fire was less than the P-47's, but the individual hits from the cannons were more destructive. The difference was philosophical as much as technical. German doctrine emphasized precision, quality over quantity. The cannon shells, when they hit, would tear aircraft apart. But they had to hit. American doctrine emphasized volume. 8 streams of fire converging on a target area created a cone of destruction that was difficult to evade. A German pilot might avoid 4 cannon shells through skilled maneuvering. He could not avoid 300 rounds of 50 caliber coming at him in 3 seconds. August 17th, 1943, marked a turning point that few recognized immediately. The deep penetration raids to Schweinfurt and Regensburg cost the 8th Air Force 60 B-17 bombers destroyed and another 17 written off from battle damage. The losses were catastrophic. The bomber offensive nearly collapsed under the attrition, but buried in the mission reports was data that would reshape the air war. The P-47 Thunderbolts, on their first deep escort mission, had shot down 19 confirmed German fighters. More significantly, they had damaged or driven off dozens more. The German attacks on the bomber formations, while devastating, had been disrupted repeatedly by Thunderbolt attacks that scattered the carefully coordinated assault waves. The Americans had discovered that concentrated firepower could break German formations even when the P-47 could not outturn or outclimb the defending fighters. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, reviewed the gun camera footage that evening in his operations tent at RAF Horsham Street, Faith. Frame by frame, he watched his pilots' attacks. The footage was grainy, shake but clear enough. German aircraft caught in the convergence zone of 850 calibers simply disintegrated. Wings separated from fuselages. Engines erupted in flame. Cockpits disappeared in clouds of fragmenting metal. Zemke was a practical man, born in Montana, trained as an engineer before he became a pilot. He understood machinery the way other men understood poetry. What he saw in that footage was not poetry. It was industrial violence applied with mechanical precision. The P-47 was not elegant. It would never match the Focke-Wulf's nimble grace or the Messerschmitt's climbing performance. But it did not need to. It was a weapon system designed around a single devastating attribute. When it hit, it obliterated. He called his flight leaders together and laid out new tactics. The Thunderbolt's advantages were altitude performance, diving speed, and overwhelming firepower. Its disadvantages were rate of climb from low altitude and sustained turning performance. Therefore, stay high, dive attack, fire in short, concentrated bursts, disengage by diving away. Climb back to altitude, repeat. Never get drawn into turning dogfights at low altitude where the German fighters could exploit their superior agility. Never waste ammunition on low-probability shots. When you had a target in range, fire everything, all 8 guns, converge the fire, destroy the target so completely it cannot return to combat. The German pilots called them Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bombers. But by late 1943, they had added a new term, 8 Maschinengewehre, 8 machine guns. The phrase was spoken with a mixture of respect and dread. Respect because the Focke-Wulf pilots were professionals who appreciated effective weapons systems. Dread because they had learned what it meant to be caught in the convergence zone. Hauptmann Wilhelm Galland, younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland and commander of 2 Gruppe, Jagdgeschwader 26, had been one of the Luftwaffe's most aggressive fighter leaders. 55 victories, Knight's Cross. Veteran of campaigns from Poland through France to Russia and back to the defense of the Reich. On August 17, 1943, over Holland, his Focke-Wulf 190 was hit by fire from a diving P-47. The convergence was not perfect. Perhaps 5 of the 8 gun streams connected, but 5 50 caliber machine guns firing for 2 seconds delivered approximately 70 rounds. Galland's aircraft lost its empennage completely. The tail section simply tore away from the fuselage. He bailed out successfully and survived to report what happened. But his aircraft, one of Germany's most advanced fighters, had been destroyed in less than 3 seconds by an American fighter that was not supposed to be able to catch him. The psychological impact was immediate. Galland was not a novice. He had survived years of combat against opponents flying aircraft as good as or better than his own, but the Thunderbolt was something different. It attacked from positions where German fighters could not effectively respond, delivered fire that German armor could not reliably stop, and absorbed return fire that would have destroyed other Allied fighters. Luftwaffe intelligence officers struggled to assess the threat. Their analysis was complicated by contradictory reports from pilots. The P-47 was slow in a climb, but it was fast in a dive, outracing everything except perhaps a Messerschmitt 109 in a full emergency power descent. It turned poorly. But American pilots had learned not to turn, instead using energy-saving dive and zoom tactics that exploited the Thunderbolt's weight. Most confusing was the firepower. German pilots reported being hit by what seemed like endless streams of bullets. Focke-Wulfs that had survived multiple combats against Spitfires and Hurricanes returned from encounters with Thunderbolts so badly shot up they were categorized as total losses. The volume of fire was unprecedented. A captured P-47 was transported to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary testing facility, in September 1943. German test pilots flew it. Engineers measured it. Armaments specialists examined the 8-gun installation with particular attention. The consensus report was sobering. The American aircraft was crude in some respects. The cockpit was large and drafty compared to German fighters. The controls were heavy at high speed. It lacked the refined handling of German designs, but the armament was brutally effective. The test pilots fired the guns at a destroyed Junkers 88 bomber positioned on the range. 3 seconds of fire, as prescribed in American tactical manuals. The Junkers, already damaged from combat, simply came apart. The wings separated from the fuselage. The cockpit section disintegrated. Pieces of the aircraft were found 200 meters from the impact point. One German engineer wrote in his report, "This is not a fighter's armament. This is a destroyer's armament." He was correct, though perhaps not in the way he intended. The P-47 had been designed, consciously or otherwise, to destroy rather than defeat. A German pilot who survived an encounter with a Focke-Wulf might return to base with battle damage and fly again the next day. A German pilot who survived an encounter with a Thunderbolt's full firepower was flying an aircraft that would likely never fly again. The industrial arithmetic was brutal. Germany could not replace aircraft as fast as America could destroy them. By the autumn of 1943, the pattern was established. The P-47 would not win aerial victories through superior maneuverability or climbing performance. It would win through industrial violence. 8 50 caliber machine guns, 3,400 rounds of ammunition, American pilots trained to exploit altitude and diving speed, all combining to create a weapons system that shattered German formations and destroyed irreplaceable aircraft. The Focke-Wulf pilots adapted. They learned to watch for the diving attacks. They learned to avoid committing to attacks when Thunderbolts held altitude advantage. They learned that the big American fighters could not be easily shaken once they committed to pursuit. But adaptation had limits. The Germans were fighting an enemy that could absorb losses and return stronger. Every Focke-Wulf destroyed was difficult to replace. Every experienced pilot killed was nearly impossible to replace. The mythology would develop later. Stories of P-47 seconds absorbing incredible battle damage and returning home. Tales of American pilots pressing attacks against overwhelming odds. Accounts of German fighters disintegrating under the Thunderbolt's guns. Some stories were exaggerated, some were understated, but the core truth remained. The Americans had brought a weapon to the European air war that the Germans had not expected and could not counter through tactical skill alone. October 1943. RAF Boxted. Colonel David Schilling reviewed the latest intelligence summary from 8th Air Force Headquarters. The document detailed German fighter pilot training curricula captured from a downed Luftwaffe aircraft. The section on defensive tactics against American fighters was revealing. Against the P-38 Lightning, exploit superior turning performance and acceleration from level flight. Against the P-51 Mustang, when it appeared, maintain altitude and avoid extended engagements where the Mustang's range advantage could be exploited. Against the P-47 Thunderbolt, never allow the American fighter to attack from superior altitude. Break formation if necessary to deny the diving attack. If engaged, use climbing turns to exploit the P-47's poor sustained climbing performance. Schilling smiled grimly. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Germans were learning, but they were learning defensive tactics, not offensive ones. The psychological balance had shifted. American pilots looked for fights. German pilots looked for ways to avoid disadvantageous engagements. That shift, subtle but unmistakable, marked the beginning of air superiority. Not dominance yet, but superiority. The Americans could go where they wanted. The Germans could try to stop them. The difference was fundamental. Private Franz Berger, Luftwaffe mechanic, 3rd Staffel, Jagdgeschwader II, crouched beside a Focke-Wulf 190 that had returned from combat that morning. His work was familiar. Patch holes, replace damaged components, test control surfaces. But this aircraft was different. The holes were larger, the damage more extensive. He counted 47 separate impacts on the starboard wing alone. The wing spar was cracked. The aileron control runs were severed in 3 places. The ammunition bay had been breached, destroying the remaining cannon shells before they could detonate. The pilot, Feldwebel Kurt Hoffmann, sat on an equipment crate nearby, smoking a cigarette with hands that shook slightly despite his best efforts at control. He had survived. His aircraft had not. Berger asked what happened. Hoffmann exhaled smoke slowly before answering. "Thunderbolt! Came from above. I never saw it until the guns opened. I thought the aircraft was coming apart around me. I counted to 10. The firing stopped. I was still alive. I do not know how." Berger examined the holes more closely. The .50 caliber rounds had punched through aluminum skin like paper. The exit holes were larger than the entry holes, classic indicators of high-velocity rounds tumbling through material. Some holes showed evidence of incendiary or tracer compounds that had ignited on impact. The pattern was not random. Someone had aimed carefully, leading the target precisely, and fired a short, controlled burst. Professional work, lethal work. That evening, Berger wrote a letter to his wife in Bavaria. He did not mention the damaged aircraft or the frightened pilot. Censors would delete such information anyway. But he wrote that the war in the air was changing. The Americans were bringing new things, better things, perhaps, things the Reich could not match. He did not say the war was lost. That would be defeatism, punishable harshly. But he implied it in careful phrases that his wife would understand. The sky over Germany was no longer German sky. The mythology had already begun to form by the end of 1943. American pilots told stories of thunderbolts that could not be killed. Aircraft riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, engines shot out, control surfaces shredded, that nonetheless brought their pilots home. The stories were largely true. The P-47's air-cooled radial engine could absorb damage that would destroy liquid-cooled engines. The large fuselage meant that critical components were spread over greater volume, reducing the likelihood that a single hit would prove catastrophic. But the German pilots developed their own mythology about the Thunderbolt. Stories of American fighters that appeared from nowhere, diving from impossible altitude, unleashing storms of fire that destroyed everything they touched, then disappearing back into the sky before German formations could respond. These stories were also largely true. The P-47's tactics exploited German weaknesses systematically. The Germans had built fighters optimized for conventional aerial combat. The Americans had built a weapons platform optimized for industrial-scale destruction. December 1943. 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson reviewed combat loss statistics for the quarter. The numbers were both encouraging and troubling. Encouraging because fighter-to-fighter kill ratios heavily favored American pilots. The P-47 units were destroying German fighters at rates approaching 4-to-1 in favorable engagements. Troubling because bomber losses remained unacceptably high. The Thunderbolt's range, even with external fuel tanks, was insufficient to escort bombers to many critical targets deep in Germany. The solution was already in development. The P-51 Mustang, with its superior range and liquid-cooled engine, would eventually replace the Thunderbolt in the long-range escort role. But that was months away. For now, the P-47 remained the primary American fighter in the European theatre, and despite its limitations, it was reshaping the air war through sheer devastating firepower. Anderson had read the intelligence reports from German POW interrogations. The captured Luftwaffe pilots described American fighter tactics with professional respect, but also unmistakable concern. The word that appeared repeatedly in translated documents was Feuerkraft. Firepower. The Americans had firepower the Germans could not match. Individual German aircraft were better in some performance metrics, but American aircraft could deliver more destruction per engagement. In industrial warfare, that difference was decisive. A German fighter pilot needed skill to aim and fire his cannons effectively. An American fighter pilot needed adequate skill to place his aircraft in position. Once in position, the .850 calibers did the rest. The difference was not trivial. It meant that average American pilots could achieve what required exceptional skill in German pilots. It meant that American units with mixed experience levels could compete effectively against veteran German formations. It meant, ultimately, that the Germans were fighting an enemy that could generate effective combat power faster than they could replace losses. The air war over Europe in 1944 would see dramatic developments. The P-51 Mustang would arrive and gradually replace the Thunderbolt in escort roles. Allied air superiority would become air dominance. The Luftwaffe would be ground down through attrition it could not sustain. But the foundation for these developments was laid in the autumn and winter of 1943, when American pilots flying heavy, crude, devastating P-47 Thunderbolts taught German pilots that superior technology and tactics could not overcome superior industrial capacity wedded to effective weapons design. The Focke-Wulf 190 was a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering. Fast, agile, beautifully balanced. German pilots loved flying it, but masterpieces could be destroyed. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not a masterpiece, it was a weapon, and weapons, applied with sufficient force and proper tactics, broke masterpieces into scattered fragments falling through cold European sky. The date was June 26, 1943. Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson was returning from an escort mission over France when 16 Focke-Wulf 190s dropped out of the clouds near Forges-les-Eaux. The attack was coordinated, professional, executed by pilots who had learned their trade destroying Soviet aircraft over the Eastern Front. Johnson's P-47, half-pint, was hit in the first pass. The 20mm cannon shells struck like hammers. One hit the canopy rail, shattering the metal frame and showering Johnson with fragments. Another punctured the hydraulic system, sending pressurized fluid spraying across the cockpit into his face, burning his eyes. A third struck the tail section, severing control cables. The P-47 rolled inverted and began to spin. Johnson tried to bail out. The canopy, damaged by cannon fire, would not open. He was trapped in a spinning aircraft with fire erupting from the engine, cowling and hydraulic fluid blinding him. The spin accelerated. Gravity pinned him against the seat. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. He was seconds from losing consciousness. Then training took over, instinct refined by hundreds of hours in the cockpit. He stopped fighting the spin and used what little control authority remained to recover. The P-47 shuddered, groaned, but obeyed. The spin stopped. He leveled the wings. The fire in the engine cowling extinguished itself, starved of fuel from ruptured lines. He was flying again, badly damaged, half-blind, but flying. The Focke-Wulf that had hit him was not finished. The German pilot, possibly Oberleutnant Egon Meyer, a veteran with more than 60 victories, came around for another pass. He lined up directly astern, less than 100 yards behind Johnson's crippled Thunderbolt, and opened fire with all weapons. The P-47 absorbed the fire. 20mm cannon shells struck the fuselage. Wings, tail, 13mm machine gun rounds punched through aluminum skin. Pieces of aircraft tore away and tumbled through the slipstream. The right aileron was shredded. The rudder was holed in a dozen places. The canopy shattered completely, sending glass fragments into Johnson's already injured face. But the P-47 continued flying. The massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, absorbed hits that would have destroyed a liquid-cooled engine instantly. Coolant lines could not be severed because there were no coolant lines. Oil could leak, but the engine continued running on whatever pressure remained. Control cables were redundant, damage to one allowing others to maintain minimal function. The German pilot made a third pass. More cannon fire, more machine gun fire. Johnson could hear the impacts, feel the aircraft shudder with each hit. He hunched down behind the armor plate behind his seat, making himself as small a target as possible. The armor stopped several rounds that would have killed him, though the impacts cracked ribs and left his back a mass of bruises. Then the firing stopped. Johnson, peering, through swollen, burning eyes past the oil-smeared windscreen, saw the Focke-Wulf pull alongside his aircraft. The German pilot looked across at him. Their eyes met. The distance between the aircraft was perhaps 50 feet, close enough to see each other clearly, close enough that Johnson could distinguish the expression on the German pilot's face. What that expression conveyed has been debated for decades. Some who heard Johnson's account believed the German had run out of ammunition and was frustrated that his target would not die. Others believed the German was simply astonished that an aircraft absorbing that much damage was still flying. Johnson believed, until his death in 1998, that the German pilot was showing respect, acknowledgement that Johnson had survived something unsurvivable. The Focke-Wulf pulled ahead, waggled its wings in a gesture universally understood among pilots as salute or farewell, and dove away toward France. Johnson was alone over the English Channel, flying a P-47 that had absorbed more than 200 hits from cannon and machine gun fire, with failing hydraulics, damaged controls, and injuries that would send him to hospital for days. He nursed the aircraft across the channel, landed at RAF Manston, and collapsed in the cockpit. Ground crews who examined Half Pint after Johnson was taken to hospital counted the holes until they reached 200 and stopped counting. The aircraft was written off as total loss, but Johnson had survived. The P-47, brutal and ungainly as it appeared, had absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any other single-engine fighter in service with any air force in the world. That capability, more than speed or agility or climbing performance, defined the Thunderbolt's value. 5 days later, Johnson was flying again. By war's end, he would accumulate 27 confirmed aerial victories, making him the second highest-scoring American ace in the European theatre. He flew 91 combat missions. His final 2 victories, a Messerschmitt 109 and a Focke-Wulf 190, came on May 8, 1944, his last mission before returning to the United States. The story of Johnson's survival spread through both American and German pilot communities. For American pilots, it confirmed what they already believed about the P-47. You could bring it home. No matter how badly shot up, no matter how extensive the damage, the Thunderbolt would fly. That confidence translated into aggressiveness. Pilots who knew they could survive battle damage pressed attacks they might otherwise have abandoned. For German pilots, Johnson's survival was more troubling. They had hit an American fighter with enough firepower to destroy 2 or 3 Spitfires. The American fighter had absorbed the damage and escaped. The implication was clear. Destroying P-47 seconds required either catastrophic damage to critical components or sustained fire that exhausted ammunition. Neither was easily achieved in the chaos of aerial combat. The industrial comparison grew starker through 1944. America produced 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts during the war. Germany produced approximately 20,000 Focke-Wulf 190s of all variants. The numbers were comparable, but the attrition rates were not. P-47 losses in the European theatre totaled 3,499 aircraft to all causes. German fighter losses on all fronts exceeded 50,000 aircraft. The disparity reflected multiple factors. American pilots received more thorough training before entering combat. American aircraft were maintained to higher standards with unlimited spare parts. American tactics evolved rapidly based on combat experience. But underlying everything was industrial capacity. America could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. German fighter pilots understood this. Arithmetic, personally. Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, killed in August 1943 after 55 victories, had told subordinates before his death that the war in the air was being lost not through superior Allied tactics, but through superior Allied production. Oberleutnant Heinz Baer, who survived the war with 220 victories, wrote after the conflict that the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. That phrase, handled very carefully, captured the psychological shift. German pilots who had entered the war confident in their aircraft's superiority and their own skill were now being forced to acknowledge that superiority and skill were insufficient. The enemy had numbers, the enemy had resources, and the enemy had weapons systems designed not for elegant aerial combat but for industrial-scale attrition. By late 1944, Luftwaffe operations over Germany had devolved into desperate attempts to intercept bomber streams despite overwhelming Allied fighter superiority. German pilots flew multiple sorties per day, facing fresh American fighter groups that rotated through combat zones with regularity. The exhaustion was physical and psychological. Every mission launched with reduced expectations of return. Every pilot knew comrades who had not returned. The replacement pilots arriving were younger, less trained, more likely to die on their first missions. Technical development could not close the gap. The Focke-Wulf 190D model, introduced in 1944 with improved high-altitude performance, was an excellent aircraft. But excellent aircraft flown by exhausted pilots with inadequate fuel and ammunition against numerically superior opponents achieved nothing decisive. The Ta-152, an even more advanced variant, arrived too late and in numbers too small to affect outcomes. American pilots, in contrast, entered combat with confidence, backed by training, equipment, and the knowledge that losses would be replaced. The psychological advantage was immeasurable. Confident pilots flew aggressively. Aggressive pilots created opportunities. Opportunities exploited with 850 caliber machine guns destroyed German aircraft faster than German industry could build them. The final months of the European Air War saw the P-47 increasingly deployed in ground attack roles. The long-range escort mission had passed to the P-51 Mustang, whose superior range and lighter weight made it ideal for bomber escort deep into Germany. But the Thunderbolt found new purpose, destroying German logistics. Trains, trucks, tanks, artillery, supply depots, airfields. The 850 caliber guns that had shattered Focke-Wulfs now shredded ground targets with equal effectiveness. German soldiers learned to fear the sound of Pratt & Whitney radials overhead. The P-47, diving from altitude with all guns firing, delivered approximately 100 rounds per second into target areas. Armored vehicles exploded, trains derailed, supply columns disintegrated. The devastation was methodical and comprehensive. By April 1945, German armies in the West were starving for fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment. Much of that starvation resulted from P-47 attacks on logistics networks. The final tally was sobering. P-47 pilots in all theaters claimed 3,752 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. They destroyed 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 trucks, and 6,000 armored vehicles. The kill ratio in fighter-to-fighter combat was approximately 4.6 to 1 in favor of the P-47. These numbers represented more than statistical outcomes. They represented the systematic destruction of German air power through weapons designed for exactly that purpose. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, surviving Luftwaffe pilots were interrogated by Allied intelligence officers. The questions focused on tactics, training, aircraft performance, and psychological factors. The responses, compiled in classified reports later declassified, revealed a consistent theme. German pilots respected the P-51 Mustang for its range and performance. They feared the P-47 Thunderbolt for its firepower and durability. One captured pilot, Lieutenant Hans Hartmann, stated in his interrogation that American fighters had destroyed German formations not through superior individual aircraft performance, but through overwhelming firepower delivered in coordinated attacks. He specifically mentioned the P-47's 8-gun armament as devastating when properly employed. Another pilot, whose name was redacted from the declassified report, described being attacked by Thunderbolts and watching his wingman's aircraft literally disintegrate under the concentrated fire. The mythology persisted after the war. Veterans gatherings featured P-47 pilots telling stories of bringing home aircraft so damaged that ground crews could not believe they had flown. German veterans acknowledged, sometimes reluctantly, that the Thunderbolt had been the most difficult American fighter to destroy. Technical historians debated whether the P-47 or P-51 was the better fighter, usually concluding that the question was meaningless without specifying mission parameters. But the fundamental truth remained simple. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been designed around 850 caliber machine guns. Everything else about the aircraft, its weight, its size, its engine, its structure, served to make those 8 guns effective in combat. The result was not elegant, it was brutally functional. And in industrial warfare, brutal functionality delivered results that elegance could not match. Robert Johnson lived until December 1998. He spent decades after the war working for Republic Aviation, the company that built the Thunderbolt, redesigning cockpit layouts to improve pilot efficiency. He gave lectures at schools and veteran organizations, always emphasizing that survival in combat required training, discipline, and the right equipment. He credited the P-47 with saving his life on June 26, 1943, and never forgot the German pilot who had stopped shooting. Historians have attempted to identify that German pilot. Egon Meyer is the most frequently cited candidate. He commanded elements of Jagdgeschwader, 2 inches, the area where Johnson was hit. He had the skill to inflict the damage Johnson's aircraft sustained. He was known for pressing attacks aggressively. And he was killed in March 1944, shot down by P-47 seconds from the 56th Fighter Group, never learning that one of his intended victims had survived to become one of America's highest-scoring aces. The Focke-Wulf 190 continued in service through the war's end. It remained a formidable aircraft, well regarded by pilots who flew it. But it had been designed for a different kind of war. A war where quality could triumph over quantity, where skilled pilots in superior aircraft could dominate numerically superior opponents. That war had existed, briefly, in 1940 and 41. By 1943, it was over. The Americans had brought industrial warfare to the European sky. They had built aircraft optimized not for individual combat excellence, but for systematic destruction of enemy air forces. They had trained pilots not to be aces, but to be effective components of larger formations. They had created tactics emphasizing coordination and mutual support over individual heroism. The system worked. The 850 caliber machine guns mounted in P-47 wings symbolized that system. Each gun individually was merely an effective weapon. 8 guns together, firing in concert with carefully calibrated convergence, became something more. They became the physical manifestation of American industrial philosophy applied to aerial warfare. Mass production, standardization, volume of fire over precision of fire, reliability over sophistication. German engineers, examining captured P-47 seconds, admired the manufacturing quality but questioned the design philosophy. The aircraft was crude in details. The cockpit layout was functional rather than refined. The controls were heavy, requiring physical strength to manipulate at high speed. Everything about the aircraft spoke to mass production rather than craftsmanship. But mass production won wars. By 1945, that truth was undeniable. The Luftwaffe had fought brilliantly with limited resources and achieved remarkable results through skill and determination. It had ultimately been overwhelmed by opponents who combined adequate skill with unlimited resources. The P-47 Thunderbolt, brutal and effective, represented that overwhelming force more completely than any other weapon in the Allied arsenal. The legacy endures. The P-47 remains one of the most recognizable aircraft of World War II. Museums preserve flying examples, their Pratt & Whitney engines still capable of the distinctive roar that terrorized German ground forces. Veterans gather to remember comrades who did not return, and historians continue analyzing the air war, seeking lessons applicable to modern conflicts. The lesson of the P-47 Thunderbolt is straightforward. Design weapons for their intended purpose without concern for elegance. Train operators thoroughly in weapons employment. Produce in quantities that ensure availability when needed. The Focke-Wulf 190 was the more beautiful aircraft. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the more effective weapon. In war, effectiveness determines outcomes. The German pilots who faced Thunderbolts learned this lesson personally. Those who survived carried the knowledge that superiority in individual aircraft performance meant nothing against an enemy who could field 4 fighters for every one you could launch. They learned that cannon fire, while devastating when it hit, was ineffective against aircraft designed to absorb damage. Most significantly, they learned that 850 caliber machine guns, properly aimed and fired, could destroy the finest fighter aircraft ever built by German industry. That knowledge came too late to change outcomes. By the time German pilots fully understood what they faced, German industry could no longer produce aircraft fast enough to replace losses. Fuel shortages, limited training. Veteran pilots were killed faster than replacements could gain experience. The Luftwaffe entered a death spiral from which no amount of technical innovation or tactical brilliance could recover. American pilots, flying P-47 seconds over Germany in early 1945, encountered minimal resistance. German fighters, when they appeared, were often flown by teenagers with less than 100 hours total flight time. These novice pilots stood no chance against American veterans flying aircraft. They understood intimately and trusted completely. The massacres were systematic. On April 20th, 1945, Major Gerald Johnson led a flight of P-47 seconds from the 56th Fighter Group on a sweep over Munich. They encountered 6 Focke-Wulf 190s attempting to intercept American bombers. The German fighters were flown competently but without the aggressive edge that characterized Luftwaffe operations earlier in the war. Johnson's flight destroyed all 6 German aircraft without loss. It was routine, expected, the natural outcome of systematic superiority. 3 weeks later, Germany surrendered. The air war in Europe was over. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies in 1940, had been destroyed. Not defeated, destroyed. The difference was significant. Defeated forces could reconstitute. Destroyed forces ceased to exist as functional entities. The 850 caliber machine guns of the P-47 Thunderbolt had contributed significantly to that destruction. Not alone, certainly. The P-51 Mustang, P-38 Lightning, and numerous other Allied aircraft had played crucial roles. But the Thunderbolt's combination of devastating firepower and remarkable durability had broken German fighter formations and killed irreplaceable pilots at rates the Luftwaffe could not sustain. The final accounting was mathematical and merciless. The 8th Air Force alone flew more than 1 million sorties over Europe. Its fighters destroyed 7,600 enemy aircraft. P-47 units accounted for more than half of those victories, despite being phased out of long-range escort duties in late 1944. The attrition inflicted exceeded Germany's ability to replace losses by a factor that made continued resistance militarily meaningless. Surviving German pilots went home to a devastated country, carrying memories of comrades killed and aircraft destroyed. They had fought well. They had flown excellent aircraft with skill and determination. They had been overwhelmed by enemies who brought resources and industrial capacity that made skill and determination insufficient for victory. American pilots went home with different memories. Memories of friends who did not return. Memories of missions flown and targets destroyed. But also confidence that they had fought with equipment adequate to the task and support structures that valued their lives enough to provide the best weapons American industry could produce. The P-47 Thunderbolt represented that commitment. Crude, heavy, effective. It brought them home. The story of the P-47 versus the Focke-Wulf 190 is ultimately the story of 2 different approaches to aerial warfare. The German approach emphasized quality, individual aircraft designed to excel in performance metrics, flown by highly trained pilots operating with tactical flexibility. The American approach emphasized quantity, mass-produced aircraft designed for specific roles, flown by adequately trained pilots operating within coordinated systems. Quality without quantity achieved nothing sustainable. Quantity without quality wasted resources. The P-47 represented quantity wedded to adequate quality, not the highest performance, not the longest range, not the fastest or most maneuverable, but heavily armed, well-built, properly supported, and available in numbers sufficient to accomplish objectives. That combination defeated the finest aircraft German engineers could design. The 850 caliber machine guns remained the P-47's defining characteristic. Veterans remembered them first when discussing the aircraft. The sound of all 8 guns firing simultaneously, the recoil shuddering through the airframe, the devastating effect on targets caught in the convergence zone. No other fighter in American service matched that firepower. No other fighter needed to. The Luftwaffe pilots who survived encounters with P-47 Thunderbolts carried their own memories. The sight of Thunderbolts diving from altitude, seemingly appearing from nowhere. The sound of 8 heavy machine guns firing in concert, a sound unlike any other aerial weapon. The results, when that fire connected with aircraft or ground targets, and the frustration of hitting Thunderbolts with fire that should have been lethal, but watching them continue flying, absorbing damage, returning to base. Those memories faded as survivors aged. The generation that fought the air war over Europe gradually passed. But the aircraft remained, preserved in museums, memorialized in histories, studied by military strategists, seeking lessons applicable to modern warfare. The P-47 Thunderbolt endures as testament to functional design achieving decisive results. When the last P-47 pilot passes, when the last veteran who serviced those engines or loaded those guns is gone, the aircraft will remain as artifact and symbol. Symbol of American industrial might applied to warfare. Symbol of the principle that adequate equipment produced in overwhelming quantities defeats superior equipment produced in limited numbers. Symbol, ultimately, of the men who flew and fought and sometimes died in aircraft designed to bring them home. The Focke-Wulf 190 remains equally symbolic. Excellence in engineering, elegance in design, proof that quality matters. But proof also that quality alone is insufficient when enemies bring quantity backed by industrial capacity and determination to apply it. The air war over Europe between 1943 and 1945 demonstrated these principles with deadly clarity. The Germans built masterpieces, the Americans built weapons. Masterpieces inspire, weapons win wars. The difference determined history. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.